Before this begins, when the moment hits, drop one word in the comments, just one. Whatever the story did to you, I read every one, every time. Now, what follows is the retirement speech of Supreme General Keth-Vel-Dorn of the Dominion Conquest Fleet. He delivered it before the Dominion's High Command on the day of his official retirement after 312 years of service. The speech was recorded and archived. It runs to approximately 1 hour. What you are about to read is that speech, reproduced in full. He was, by the time he delivered it, 440 years old. He had fought in 41 campaigns. He had overseen the conquest or subjugation of 400 civilizations. He had never, in 312 years, lost an engagement he had committed to completing. He retired voluntarily on his own timeline for reasons that the speech itself explains. The High Command has reviewed this speech 1,100 times. They are still reviewing it. Pay attention to the end. I have been trying to decide for several weeks what to say today. This is unusual for me. I am not known for difficulty with decisions. 312 years of service has required a great many decisions, and I have made them all without the kind of prolonged uncertainty I have experienced in preparing this speech. The uncertainty is not about what happened. I know exactly what happened. The uncertainty is about how to describe what it means. What happened and what it means are different things, and the gap between them is where I have been living for the past several months. I will try to bridge the gap today. If I cannot fully bridge it, I want at least to describe it accurately. You deserve an accurate description from someone who was there. I want to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of my career. You all know my record, and I am not going to rehearse it in detail today. I want to start at the beginning of what made my career possible. I want to start with what the Dominion Conquest Fleet is and why it works. Because understanding what we are and why we work is necessary for understanding what happened on a Tuesday when I was 439 years old, and the fleet encountered a species called humanity for the first time. And I want to be clear about something before I describe that encounter. The fleet worked for 312 years. What happened on that Tuesday was not a failure of the fleet. It was an encounter with something the fleet was not designed for. Those are different things. I want to make sure that distinction is clearly on the record before I say anything else. The Dominion Conquest Fleet works because of a simple principle. The principle is this. Most civilizations, when facing an overwhelmingly superior force, make a rational calculation. The calculation is, can we resist effectively? And for 400 civilizations across 200 years, the answer to that calculation has been no. Not because those civilizations were weak. Many of them were not weak. Some of them were impressive by any standard. Some of them had military capacity that in isolation would have been formidable, but none of them had military capacity that was sufficient to resist what we brought to bear. And when they calculated that their capacity was insufficient, they did what rational actors do. They calculated the cost of resistance versus the cost of submission, and they chose the path that produced the better expected outcome. Submission, integration, the acceptance of dominion oversight, 400 times. The principle held. I want to talk about some of the 400. Not all of them, we would be here for several years. But some of them, the ones that were difficult, the ones that required more than the standard deployment, the ones that made me think hardest about what we were doing and how. I want to talk about them because I think understanding the range of what we encountered is necessary for understanding what was different about the humans. The most difficult campaign before the humans was the YearsThey. They were a martial civilization. Their entire social structure was organized around conflict. Their history was a history of war, internal war, regional war, war as a cultural practice and a social institution and a philosophical framework. When we arrived, they did not calculate in the way most civilizations calculate. They attacked, immediately and without negotiation. They attacked with everything they had, and they had significant military capacity, and the engagement lasted 11 years and cost us more than any other single campaign in our history. We won. We always won. But the YearsThey made us work for it. They fought until they could not fight anymore. And when they could not fight anymore, they submitted, Completely, totally, with the specific completeness of a warrior culture that had given everything and acknowledged the result. I respect Ted them for that. I still do. In 312 years, they were the hardest thing we faced before the humans. I also want to talk about the Keth-Vel because they were different from the Vel-Saketh in a way that matters for what I am going to say about the humans. The Keth-Vel were not a martial civilization. They were philosophers, scientists. Their culture was organized around knowledge accumulation and the exchange of ideas. They had no meaningful military capacity. When we arrived, they did not attack. They sent representatives. The representatives asked questions, not about our terms, about us. Who we were, where we had come from, what we had seen. They wanted to understand us before they decided what to do about us. I found this interesting at the time. I deployed our standard approach and they submitted within 6 months, but I remembered them afterward. The curiosity, the specific quality of wanting to understand before deciding. I filed it and moved on. I should have thought about it more. I want to talk about the pattern, 400 civilizations. Some martial, some philosophical, some technologically advanced, some early in their development, some with strong organizational capacity, some highly individualistic, all of them different, all of them producing the same response when we arrived, the rational calculation, the assessment of resistance viability, the conclusion that resistance was not viable, the submission, 400 times. After a while, and I mean this not as criticism but as an honest description of what happens when something works for a very long time, after a while you stop questioning the pattern. The pattern becomes the expectation. The expectation becomes the framework. The framework becomes the lens through which you see every new civilization you encounter. You arrive. You deploy. You wait for the calculation to produce the expected result. You integrate. You move on. 400 times in 200 years. The pattern held so consistently that questioning it began to feel not just unnecessary but slightly absurd. What would it mean to question something that has worked 400 times? What would it mean to say, perhaps this time the pattern will not hold? I had 400 data points, 400 identical outcomes. The pattern was the most reliable thing in my professional life. I stopped seeing it as a pattern. I started seeing it as a law. I was 439 years old when we arrived at the Sol system, third planet, one yellow star, class 4 species in early technological development by our assessment. I had read the intelligence file. I had reviewed the capability assessments. I had done what I had done 400 times. I had deployed the standard approach. We arrived in formation, overwhelming force, comprehensive capability demonstration. The standard communication package, in whatever translation we had available, explaining the terms and the timeline. I had never had a species fail to respond to the standard communication package within 48 hours. The humans responded within 6 hours. This was faster than average. I noted it and did not think much of it. Speed of response in the initial phase has never been a reliable predictor of outcome. What I should have paid more attention to was the content of the response. The content was unusual. Most civilizations, in their initial response to the standard communication package, respond to the power. They acknowledge the power. They ask questions about the terms of submission, or they signal that they are considering resistance and want to demonstrate their capacity before submitting. The humans did not respond to the power. They responded to the communication. They asked questions about us. Who were we? Where had we come from? How many civilizations had we encountered? What happened to them afterward? They wanted to understand us. I thought about the Keth-Vel. I noted the similarity and did not think enough about what the similarity might mean. The first 48 hours proceeded in ways I had not experienced before. The humans were communicating extensively, but the communication was not the communication I was used to receiving. It was not negotiation, and it was not capitulation, and it was not defiance. It was inquiry. They were asking questions, a great many questions, about our history, our objectives, our structure, our previous campaigns. They asked about the Vel-Saketh. They asked about the Keth-Vel. They asked about the terms of integration for the civilizations that had submitted. They wanted to understand the full picture of what they were dealing with before they responded to it. I recognized this. I had seen it once before in a single civilization, and I had noted it and moved on. I was seeing it again, more intensively, and I began to understand that the note I had filed about the Keth-Vel-Dorn was more significant than I had treated it. A civilization that wants to understand before deciding is a civilization that is going to make a more informed decision than one that reacts. I began to pay closer attention to the questions they were asking. Not to answer them. I was not in the business of answering questions. I was in the business of receiving submissions. But to understand what the questions told me about how they thought. By the end of the first week, I had reached a conclusion that I want to describe carefully, because it was the first time in my career that a conclusion of this kind had caused me to pause before acting. The conclusion was, I do not know what they are going to do. I want you to understand what that sentence means in the context of a career that had produced 400 identical outcomes from 400 different starting points. I had never not known what they were going to do. Not in the general sense they were always going to submit, that was the invariant, but in the specific sense of how the submission would arrive, early or late, defiant or compliant, negotiated or unconditional. I had always been able to read the trajectory within the first few days. With the humans, by the end of the first week, I could not read the trajectory. Not because they were hiding it, because the trajectory was genuinely not determined yet. They were still deciding. And they were deciding in a way that I could not model, because the decision-making process they were using was not one I had encountered before. They were not calculating. They were deliberating. These are different things. Calculation produces a result. Deliberation produces a position. The result of calculation is determined by the inputs. The position produced by deliberation is determined by the values of the deliberators, and I did not know their values well enough to predict the position. The second week brought something I had not experienced in 312 years of service. My second-in-command, General Keth-Vel-Dorn, came to me with a report from the Intelligence Division. The report described what the humans had been doing internally during the first week, not their communications with us, those I had been monitoring directly. Their internal communications, what they had been saying to each other. The report was unusual because the content of the internal communications was not what we typically found in the internal communications of civilizations in the early stages of contact. Typically, internal communications at this stage are dominated by two things: assessments of our military capability and discussions of submission terms. The humans' internal communications were dominated by something else. They were dominated by history. They were telling each other stories about their own history, specifically stories about times when they had faced situations that appeared to have only two options, both bad, and had found a third. I have described before the specific human characteristic of refusing the premise. I was seeing it here in real time in the deliberation process. They were not asking, do we submit or resist? They were asking, what else is possible? And they were drawing on 6,000 years of their own history to inform the answer. I read the report and I sat with it for a long time. And then I did something I had never done before in 400 campaigns. I requested an extension of the initial contact period. I told my command that I needed more time to assess the situation before proceeding to the standard integration phase. The request was granted. I suspect the high command that granted it is now grateful it did. The third week. I want to be specific about the third week because the third week is when I understood what I was dealing with, and understanding it changed not just how I handled this campaign, but how I understood everything I had done in 312 years. In the third week, the humans sent us a document, not a response to our terms, not a counter-proposal to our terms, a document. It was several thousand words and it contained two things. The first thing was an acknowledgement of our history, the 400 civilizations, the 200 years, the consistent outcomes. They had researched us. They had found accounts of our previous campaigns from species in the galactic community that had records of what we had done. They knew our record as well as we did. And the second thing, the thing that I have been trying to describe accurately for several months and that I am going to attempt to describe now, The second thing was a proposal. Not a proposal about terms of submission, a proposal about what came after, about what we could build together, about what the relationship between us and them could look like if the relationship was built on something other than conquest. It was detailed and specific, and it addressed things that I had not considered addressable. It was, in the specific way that things are, remarkable when they come from something that has no obligation to be remarkable. I read it 3 times. I sent it to my command with a note that said, "I believe we need to reconsider our approach to this campaign." The response from command was, "Explain." I spent 4 days writing the explanation. It was the longest document I had produced in my career. And in it, I said something that I had never said in 312 years of service. I said, "I do not think we should proceed with the standard integration approach. I think we should talk to them." What followed the document exchange is in the official record, and I will not rehearse it in full here. What I want to tell you is the moment. The specific moment, because every campaign has a moment that defines it, that you carry with you long after the campaign is over, and the files are archived, and the strategic analysts have done their work and produced their assessments. The moment in the Vel-Saketh campaign was a morning on their third moon when the last of their fleet met ours, and we both knew the outcome before the engagement began, and they engaged anyway. The moment in other campaigns were different moments. A negotiation that produced an unexpected outcome, a resistance that lasted longer than the projections, a submission that came faster than anticipated. Every campaign has its moment. The moment in the human campaign was quiet. It was not a battle, and it was not a negotiation. It was a conversation. It was my first direct conversation with a human. Her name was Dr. Chen Wei, the same diplomat who later represented them at the New Geneva talks. She was brought to the fleet's communication station by shuttle, which itself was a thing that had never happened before, a representative of a species that had received our standard communication package, voluntarily coming to us rather than waiting for us to come to them. She came aboard. We sat across from each other in a room with a viewport that showed the third planet of the Sol system, blue and green and white, below us. And she said, without preamble, "You have done this 400 times. What happened to the ones that submitted?" I told her. I told her in more detail than I had ever provided to any representative of any species in any campaign, because something in the directness of the question required directness in the answer. I told her about the integration process and what it involved, and what the civilizations that had submitted had experienced in the years and decades after. Some of those outcomes were better than what those civilizations had been heading toward before we arrived. Some were not. I was honest about both. I told her about the Vel-Saketh and what they had become after submission, and whether I thought they were better or worse for the experience. She asked good questions, specific questions. She was clearly using our conversation to learn things that the document exchange had not told her. And at the end of the conversation, she said something that I have been sitting with ever since. She said, "I want to tell you what I am going to recommend to my government." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to recommend that we do not submit." I said, "I understand." She said, "And I am not going to recommend that we resist." I said, "I understand." And then she was quiet for a moment, and she said, "I am going to recommend that we continue talking to you, because I think there is something we can build here that is better than what the standard approach produces. For both of us, not just for us, for you as well." And I looked at her across the table with 400 campaigns and 312 years behind me. And I said, "That is not in the protocol." She said, "I know. I think the protocol might be the problem." I retired voluntarily 6 months after the conversation with Dr. Chen Wei. Not because the campaign failed. In the conventional sense, it did not fail. Because the engagement did not proceed and the integration process did not conclude. And a campaign that does not proceed and does not conclude is not a failure. It is something else. I retired because I had spent 312 years building and refining and executing a framework that had worked for 400 civilizations in 200 years, and I had met something that the framework was not equipped to handle, and I had recognized in that something the answer to a question I had not known I was asking. The question was, what is all of this for? The conquest, the integration, the expansion of the dominion, 400 civilizations, 200 years, 312 years of my life. What is it for? I had never seriously asked that question before the humans because the framework had never required me to ask it. The framework had a goal, expansion, stability, the extension of dominion administration to new territories. And the goal was clear, and the method worked, and I executed the me. Though and the goal was achieved and I moved on. 400 times. I had never asked what the goal was for because the goal was self-evident, and asking what a self-evident thing is for is not a question that experienced professionals tend to ask. And then a woman from a planet we had arrived to conquer sat across from me and said, I think there is something we can build here that is better than what the standard approach produces. For both of us. I want to describe the 117th campaign specifically because it was the campaign that, in retrospect, should have told me something I did not learn until the humans taught it to me. The 117th campaign was against a civilization called the YearsThey. They were a species of moderate technological capability and significant organizational capacity. When we arrived, they did not fight and they did not immediately submit. They negotiated. Not the terms of their submission, the terms of our engagement. They asked us to explain in detail what we were doing and why, not strategically, philosophically. They wanted to understand the purpose behind the expansion, what the Dominion was building and what role integration played in that building. I was impatient with this at the time. I had a campaign to complete, and I had other campaigns scheduled, and the YearsThey's philosophical questions were not on the agenda. I provided minimal responses and pressed forward with the standard approach. They submitted within 4 months. Standard outcome. I filed the campaign and moved on. What I did not think about until much later was what the YearsThey were actually doing. They were not stalling. They were not trying to find a weakness in our position. They were genuinely asking. They wanted to understand the purpose because understanding the purpose was part of how they made decisions. They were a civilization that evaluated actions by their purposes, and they were trying to evaluate our action before responding to it. I did not give them adequate information to complete that evaluation. I gave them the standard information and pressed forward. If I had given them what they were asking for, a real answer to the real question, the outcome might have been different. Not necessarily better for us in the short term, but different. I did not think about this until I met the humans and the humans asked the same kind of question, and I found myself actually answering it. And in answering it, I understood that the YearsThey had deserved the same answer 180 years earlier and had not received it. I do not know what to do with that. I note it here because it belongs in the record. I want to describe the moment before the moment. The thing that happened the day before I first met Dr. Chen Wei that I have not included in any official account, because it did not seem officially relevant, but that I think is the most personally significant thing that happened in the entire engagement. The day before our meeting, I was in the fleet's observation room. The observation room has a viewport that shows the target system without the tactical overlays, just the system as it is without the data. I was there in the early hours of the morning because I was not sleeping. I had not been sleeping well since the human document arrived. And I was looking at the third planet, blue and green and white. And I thought something that I had not thought in 312 years of looking at inhabited planets from orbit. I thought, there are people down there. Not as a tactical consideration, just as a fact, people. A species with 6,000 years of history and stories and failure and recovery, and the specific quality I had identified in their deliberations, and I was about to execute a process that would change everything about what their civilization was and what it would become. And I had executed this process 400 times, and I had not thought this thought in 400 times. Why did I think it this time? I have been asking myself that question. My honest answer is, because the document they sent me made it impossible not to. The The document was about what we could build together. And you cannot think about what you could build together with something without thinking about what that something is, what it has been and what it might become, and what it is right now at this moment, while I am looking at it from orbit at 3 in the morning. People. 439 years old, and I looked at a planet from orbit and I thought, people. And then I went and prepared for the meeting. I want to describe what the humans said about the 400, because they brought it up and I think what they brought up and why they brought it up matters. In our second day of formal negotiation, after the meeting with Dr. Wei, after my recommendation to command, after the protocol review that my recommendation triggered, the humans asked about Pacific civilization, not in general, specifically. They had names, they had history, they had accounts from the galactic community's shared archive of what had happened to specific civilizations after integration. And they asked, were these outcomes good for those civilizations? Not in the sense of survival, they understood the integration process ensured survival in most cases. In the sense of flourishing, did these civilizations, after integration, become more of what they were trying to become? Or less? I had never been asked this question before, not in 400 campaigns. No representative of any civilization had ever asked me whether the civilizations that preceded them had flourished under integration. They had asked about terms, about protections, about specific provisions. They had not asked about flourishing. I did not have a complete answer to the flourishing question. I had records of economic outcomes and stability metrics and the standard indicators we use to assess integration success. I did not have a record of whether the integrated civilizations felt they had become more of what they were trying to become. I told the humans this honestly. I said, we do not typically measure that. And the lead negotiator, Dr. Osai, said, that might be part of what we should discuss. And I said, yes, I think it might be. The question of flourishing has stayed with me through the months since the engagement. I want to address it directly because I think it is the most important unresolved question in my professional legacy, and I am not going to leave this room without at least acknowledging it honestly. I spent 312 years executing an expansion strategy on behalf of the Dominion. The strategy worked by the metrics we used to measure it. Civilizations were integrated. Stability was extended. The Dominion's reach expanded. These outcomes were real. The metrics were real. And I have been wondering since Dr. Osa asked her question whether the metrics were the right metrics, whether measuring economic outcomes and stability indicators and integration success rates was measuring the right things, whether flourishing, the specific question of whether integrated civilizations became more of what they were trying to become, was something we should have been measuring and were not. I do not know the answer. I do not have the data to know the answer. What I know is that the humans asked the question and I could not answer it. And I have been in this work for 312 years and I should have been able to answer it. The inability to answer it means either the question does not matter or we have not been measuring what matters. I am not prepared to accept that the question does not matter, which means we have not been measuring what matters. I am leaving this service believing that the most important reform we could undertake is to begin measuring what matters, beginning with the question the humans asked, did they flourish? I want to tell you what happened at the end of my conversation with Dr. Chen Wei, not the strategic content that is in the record. What happened at the end? We had been talking for approximately 3 hours. The viewport still showed the third planet below us. The conversation had covered the history of the Dominion's expansion, the specifics of the integration process, the outcomes for previous civilizations, the humans' own history and what it had produced in them, the proposal they had made for an alternative path. And at the end, when the formal content of the conversation was exhausted and we were both sitting quietly for a moment, she said something that was not part of the negotiation and that I do not think she had planned to say. She said, "You are very tired," I said. "I have been in service for a long time," she said. "That is not what I mean," she said. "You have been doing this for 312 years and I think you know it is not enough." I said, "What do you mean?" she said. "I think you know that what you have built 400 civilizations, 200 years, I think you know that it is not enough to have brought them in. that what you bring them into matters as much as the bringing. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "Yes, I know that," she said. "Then I think you should help us build something that is enough, something that actually matters to the ones who are brought in." I said, "That is not my role." She said, "I know, but you could retire and make it your project." She said it simply, the way people say things that are obvious once someone says them. I retired 6 months later. This speech is the beginning of the project. The High Command has asked me, in the conversations that preceded this retirement, what I recommend. Not about the human campaign specifically. Those negotiations are ongoing and the diplomatic teams are handling them. About the broader approach. About what I have learned in 312 years and what I would do differently if I were beginning again. I want to give that recommendation here in this speech because I think it belongs in the record and I think it is the most useful thing I can say on my way out. My recommendation is this: ask the flourishing question before you arrive, before the standard communication package, before the deployment of overwhelming force, before the rational calculation is triggered and the submission process begins. Send one person, not a general, not a diplomat, someone who can sit across from a representative of the civilization and ask, "What are you trying to become? What does flourishing look like for you? What would you build if you had more time and more resources and more peace than you currently have?" Ask the question and listen to the answer. And then, and this is the hard part, the part I did not do for 312 years, take the answer seriously when you decide what to do next. The humans asked us what we were building. They asked it before they decided what to do about us. That is why the engagement did not proceed in the standard way, because they asked first, and because I answered honestly, and because honest answers to sincere questions produce something that the standard communication package has never produced in 400 campaigns. They produce understanding. And understanding, actual, real, two-directional understanding, produces possibilities that the standard approach cannot generate, including the possibility that what you build together is better than what you could have built through conquest. That is my recommendation. Ask the flourishing question. Listen to the answer. See what becomes possible. There is one more thing I want to say before I sit down. It is personal rather than professional, and I want to say it because I have spent 312 years being professional, and I think the balance needs correcting before I leave. I have met, in 312 years of service, a very large number of beings from a very large number of species. Most of those meetings were brief, professional, transactional, the standard communication package, the integration process. The next campaign, I was good at the professional and transactional. I am less good at what I am about to say. What I want to say is that the conversation with Dr. Chen Wei was the best conversation I have had in 312 years. Not because it was strategically significant, though it was. Not because it changed the direction of the campaign, though it did. Because she talked to me as though I was a person who might be interested in the same thing she was interested in. Which was, what are we building here? What does any of this produce that is worth producing? Are we doing this in a way that could be done better? I have met people in 400 campaigns. I had not been met in 400 campaigns, not in that way. The humans met me. They arrived in our communication station and sat across from me and asked questions that assumed I was worth asking. Not because they needed something from me, they were negotiating for their civilization's future. They had ample reason to be strategic about how they treated me. But the questions did not feel strategic. They felt genuine. I have thought about this a great deal. I think the genuineness is a quality of the species and not a strategy of the specific individuals. I think they are genuinely interested in the things they ask about. I think they asked me what I had built and what had happened to it, not because they needed that information to negotiate, but because they actually wanted to know. And being talked to by someone who actually wants to know is different from being talked to by someone who needs something. I had not noticed the difference until I experienced it. That is the most personal thing I have to say today. They met me. I think that matters. The speech ended here in the original recording. Supreme General Keth-Vel-Dorn sat down. The High Command was silent for a period that the recording documents as 1 minute and 43 seconds. Then the proceedings continued. The general had lived for another 31 years after the speech, during which time he worked, as Dr. Way had suggested, on the project he had named at the end of the speech. He died at 471. His project, a formal framework for what he called the flourishing assessment, a set of protocols for measuring and tracking whether integrated civilizations became more of what they were trying to become, was adopted by the Dominion 7 years after his death. It was adopted partly because of its merits, which were real. It was adopted partly because of something that happened in the years between the speech and the adoption. The human civilization, which had never been integrated, had grown to be one of the most significant in the galactic community, and the Dominion's ANA lists, reviewing the comparative data, had concluded that the specific quality that made the humans significant was exactly what the general had tried to describe in his speech. They had been allowed to become more of what they were trying to become. They had not been integrated and shaped and directed. They had been met, as he had put it, and then allowed to continue. And what they became, when they were met and allowed to continue, was something that the 400 integrated civilizations had not become. Something that produced outcomes the Dominion had not achieved through 400 conquests. Something that the general had tried to name in his speech, and that the diplomatic record, over the 30 years after the speech, gradually came to describe with a word the humans themselves used for it: flourishing. The Dominion finally learned to measure flourishing. The humans had been demonstrating it all along. The note that the High Command added to the archive of this speech, written 11 years after its delivery, reads as follows. This speech was reviewed 1,047 times in the 11 years following its delivery. The reviews have produced the following institutional conclusions. First, the general's assessment of the human campaign was accurate. The standard approach would not have produced the standard outcome. Second, the general's recommendation regarding the flourishing question has been implemented in the form of the flourishing assessment framework, adopted 7 years after his death. Third, the general's personal account of his conversation with Dr. Chen Wei and his description of being met has been the subject of more discussion in the High Command than any other single passage in any document in our institutional history. We have discussed it because it points to something that we do not know how to measure, but that appears to be operationally significant. The capacity of one being to make another being feel genuinely met, engaged with as a person rather than as a function. The humans appear to do this as a default. We do not know if this is a cultural feature or a civilizational one or something inherent to what they are. We know that it had a measurable effect on a general with 312 years of service who had never previously encountered it. We know that the general changed his behavior in response to it. We know that the change in his behavior changed the campaign. We know that the changed campaign led to changed outcomes that have proven more beneficial to the Dominion than the standard outcomes would have been. The causal chain is clear. What is not clear is how to teach the thing that caused the chain. You cannot train a civilization to genuinely want to know. Either it does or it does not. The humans do. We are working on what to do with that. End of note. I want to end with what I actually believe. Not the official position and not the strategic analysis and not the institutional framing. What I actually believe, after 312 years of service and 400 campaigns and one conversation on a Tuesday. I believe the protocol is the problem. I believe the framework that has worked for 400 civilizations in 200 years has worked because we brought overwhelming force to bear on civilizations that made rational calculations about resistance. And rational calculations about resistance in the face of overwhelming force produce predictable outcomes. And predictable outcomes are very comfortable if you are the one producing them. I believe that comfort is a form of blindness. I believe that what the humans did, the refusal to calculate in the standard way, the deliberation instead of calculation, the choice to ask what else is possible instead of which of these options is better, I believe that what the humans did revealed the blindness. Not maliciously, not as a strategy against us, as a natural consequence of being what they are. They are a species that does not accept the presented frame, that looks for what is not on the list, that asks what we could build together rather than what will happen if I resist. And when we met that species, the framework that had worked for 400 civilizations in 200 years did not work. And the question is not why did the framework fail? The question is what the failure reveals about the framework. And what it reveals is that the framework assumes the presenting frame will be accepted, that the calculation will be made within the terms of the terms, that no one will ask what else is possible. 400 times no one asked. On a Tuesday they asked, and I did not have an answer. And I am ending my career believing that the absence of an answer was the most significant thing that has ever happened to me. Drop one word in the comments. Whatever this story did to you, I am reading every single one. Subscribe to UG Human HFY. The next story is a completely different voice and a completely different angle. That is the promise.